So, who amongst you remembers the Super Friends? Show of hands? Anybody? No? Okay, well let me explain. The Super Friends was an old cartoon that aired back in 1973 on ABC. It was produced by Hanna-Barbera and was kind of an ultra kid-friendly version of the Justice League that starred your favorite superheroes, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and Robin, among others, who would come and go as the series progressed. Except they weren't allowed to punch or kick anybody, so it was mostly just them sometimes breaking stuff and kind of engaging in some weird-ass shenanigans. In traditional Hanna-Barbera fashion, they felt the need to include some even more kid-friendly sidekicks that were created specifically for the show that everyone tends to remember with some kind of disdain. Godzuki and Scrappy, I'm looking at you. In the case of Super Friends, there were actually a few. The first of which premiered with the show in 1973, Wendy, Marvin, and the Wonder Dog. These characters would only last for the show's initial 16-episode run, at which point it was cancelled. The show would be renewed 3 years later in 1977 under the title The All-New Super Friends Hour, where they promised to ramp up everything from the original show, which means they needed new sidekicks with actual powers. Enter the Wonder Twins, an intergalactic duo who would fight alongside our heroes with their blue pet monkey, Gleek. The Wonder Twins, Jaina and Zane, are extraterrestrial twins from the planet of Exor, whose parents died from a plague when they were still babies, and apparently, no one wanted to adopt them. So they would be instead adopted by a space circus leader who would bring them in because of their unique powers and give them Gleek as a pet. See, Jaina and Zane are shapeshifters, with Zane having the ability to transform into any body of water, and Jaina the ability to transform into any animal. However, they can only do so when they put their hands together and say Wonder Twin powers activate. I actually don't know if that's a prerequisite to activating their powers, but hey, a catchphrase is a catchphrase, all about that branding, you know? They would later escape the circus as teens and rush to Earth to warn Superman about a pending attack from the villainous Grax. This is how they would become the newest sidekicks for the Super Friends. Well, until the show got cancelled and the characters were relegated to obscurity. They would make various appearances in the comics from time to time, with some attempted revamps to make them cooler, including appearances in Smallville and an all-but-a-name appearance in Justice League Unlimited, but you just can't do it with the Wonder Twins, you guys. You just kind of have to lean into the silly. Enter Mark Russell, author of similar Hanna-Barbera reboots such as the Flintstone series and the Snagglepuss Chronicles, another series we've talked about in the past that you should watch when you're done with this video. Mark Russell has a tendency to take these cartoonish and silly characters and use them to make sharp, hilarious satire with shockingly deep commentary on socio-political issues. And in February 2019, he decided to give that treatment to the Wonder Twins in what started as a 6-issue miniseries but was expanded to a 12-issue maxi-series. As it turns out, if you're willing to embrace the silliness and whimsy that characters like the Wonder Twins can bring, you can use them to make complex commentary on the various systems of inequality that allow a ruling class to constantly have a lower class to suppress and dominate. Fun! Let's dive in. Our story opens up in Morris High School, where our heroes have started attending with Jaina doing the morning announcements. Zane, on the other hand, is busy in class giving a presentation for Heritage Day about his home planet of Exor. Exor is a civilization that is completely devoid of poverty and violence, where crime doesn't happen unless someone is just really bored, where every societal ill has been conquered and they prosper for it. He then proceeds to start describing how a thunderstorm forces all citizens of Exor to uncontrollably engage in a massive orgy until he is, not surprisingly, cut off by his teacher. Jaina and Zane meet up with their super suits after school, and they head over to the next phase of their apparently new life on Earth. A new job over at the Hall of Justice. Inside said hall, Superman is explaining their new interns to Batman and Wonder Woman, who seem less than impressed with the Wonder Twins' particular power set. Superman goes on to explain that he's taken them in as a favor to their father, who says they can't stay on their planet for mysterious reasons. While they don't necessarily like it, they both accept it and allow Superman to give the twins a tour of the Hall of Justice. Superman explains the hall operates as basically a dispatch center for the heroes, so they don't all respond to the same crime, and that the hero sent is the most appropriate one for the task at hand. He leads them to the old control room with their supercomputer. Or at least it was supercomputer before cell phones took over. Now it's mostly there just to play music. The tour is interrupted by Hawkman, however, who says that a body has been found in a nearby park that carries energy signatures from the 5th dimension. This means it can only be the work of Mixius Spitlick, a magical trickster deity from the 5th dimension known to wield reality-altering powers that he mostly uses to annoy Superman. While the rules on how to defeat him have kind of bounced around over the years, the most reoccurring is that he will vanish back to the 5th dimension if you can trick him into saying his name backwards. Like I said, we're leaning into the silly here, just roll with it. The Justice League leave the twins in the control room to handle the interdimensional threat. This gives them the opportunity to acquaint themselves with the supercomputer, which turns out to have personality all its own and looks eerily like a pixelated version of those old face ads from Nick Jr. Anyone else remember those? Ugh. Luckily, the Justice League is able to handle the trickster without the twins' help, and they go about their business. That is, until the following day, when Mixius Spitlick decides to storm the Hall of Justice and confront the twins, who are the only ones there. He loudly pronounces who he is and his intentions, until Janet just has Supercomputer play what he said backwards and banishes back to the 5th dimension. So yeah, they seem to be catching on to this whole superhero gig pretty quick. But are they ready to handle more dangerous threats? They'll soon find out as we're introduced to the Scrambler, currently being held in Lexicon Private Prison. The Scrambler is a mind switcher capable of putting the consciousness of one person into the body of another. Unfortunately, nobody bothered to tell the guard that, because after some back and forth on inhumane treatment he receives at the prison, correctly pointing out how people are only 3 parking tickets away from receiving it, I might add, he swaps minds with the guard and swaps back once he lets his original body out of his cell, escaping by just walking out the front door. Meanwhile, Jaina and Zane are on their way to the prison themselves, not to stop the Scrambler from escaping, but because her school had some budget cuts and this was the only place they can go on a field trip for free. As they tour Lexicon, their tour guide regales them with how their state contracts allow them to have rehabilitation programs for their inmates, although the reality just looks like free labor for a call center selling home security. Jaina questions how this could possibly be counted as rehabilitation, but the tour guide counters that the customer service experience makes them valuable employees once they get out. She continues that 9 out of 10 inmates that receive their vocational training don't reoffend, to which Jaina responds that that basically means 90% of these people don't need to be there in the first place. This gets the two promptly kicked out, and they end up being taken by Superman to Beast Boy while he's filming a commercial. Being a long-standing member of the Teen Titans, Superman seems to believe that Beast Boy may have some expertise to provide the duo. Meanwhile, the Scrambler contacts Lex Luthor to see about rejoining the Legion of Doom, but his spot has apparently been filled. However, he might have an off-branch in the Legion that the Scrambler could work for instead as a kind of audition. Back at the Hall of Justice, Beast Boy talks them through the standard superhero process, including continuously bringing the villains back to prison once they get out. Jaina questions the logic of this, but Beast Boy kinda dodges the question by sending them after the League of Annoyance to show them how well the system works. We then move to a meeting of the League of Annoyance, seemingly taking place in a break room of an abandoned toy factory. The League of Annoyance consists of various Z-list supervillains such as Cell Phone Sylvia, Amphetamine, Druncula, the Melingier, and their leader, Praying Mantis, who describes the League as both a hive of villainy and a fun place to work. They welcome their newest member, the Scrambler, who couldn't give less of a shit about being there, but for moving on to their evil agenda. Praying Mantis asks Druncula what he's working on before he angrily states his name was Baron Nightblood, and takes issue with being defined by his drinking. He goes on to explain that he's trying to turn away from biting people because he takes on the alcohol contents of his victims, and he just reached 30-day sobriety. He knows this triggers and he's trying to stay clean. But Mantis kinda questions the point of having a vampire on the team if he doesn't bite people, so Baron angrily agrees to do it. The Wonder Twins are alerted by the Baron's activities as he stalks his prey, taking very careful notice on whether or not his victims had anything to drink. As they fight, Baron Nightblood protests that he doesn't want to be there, that he's caught in a cycle he can't escape from. As he exclaims, "All I wanted was to focus on my sobriety. I finally felt like I had the freedom to choose my own path for the first time in centuries. But you people just won't let me. Heroes, villains, you're all the same. You only be anything that's not useful to you. The truth is you don't want me to get better. You don't want me to go straight. If we all got our lives back on track, you wouldn't know what to do with yourselves." The Wonder Twins promptly defeat the vampire, but feel pretty conflicted about it. They're forced to take him to a private prison since the local jail is full, but they don't seem to know where to put him either. The next day, Jaina argues with Beast Boy about the ethics of what they do, saying that the villains they put away only end up working for Lex Luthor the next day, that justice is a euphemism for cheap labor, that heroes are just a human resources department for a telemarketing scam. The conversation is interrupted by Zane opening up a package to find a circus monkey he ordered that he names Gleek, and the buzzer that tells him the Baron is ready for pickup. When they arrive at the prison, the twins are informed that they had to put Baron Nightblood in the drunk tank due to overcrowding. The twins panic and quickly burst into the drunk tank to find a distraught man, surrounded by bodies, simply saying that he never wanted any of this. Sometime later, Jaina ends up making a connection at school with a woman named Polymath, the daughter of Nobel Prize winner Philomath, who shares her father's love for science. They later go to the Hall of Justice where Superman congratulates them on their first villain bust, but Jaina seems less than enthused, asking Superman how he does it. Sure, they stopped Baron Nightblood last night, but all it did was ruin his life and killed a bunch of hockey fans. She asks, how do you come to this planet as an outsider, see all the problems this world has, and convince yourself that you're making any difference whatsoever? Superman replies, we're all outsiders to this world, even the people born here. We're all making it up as we go along, just guessing at what the world needs from us. Unfortunately, human history is a rich tapestry of bad guesses. But if you're going to live on this planet, there's something you need to understand. On Earth, the most important power you can have isn't shapeshifting, it isn't flight or strength or invulnerability. is seeing everything wrong with this world and somehow not going crazy. Meanwhile, Philomath is attempting to resign from LexCorp, much at the behest of Lex himself, who reminds him that under contract, he'd have to pay back the $10 million loan he was given for his projects by doing so. He eventually relents, and Lex reassigns him to the League of Annoyance in order to work off his debt in 1 year's time. While the League seems happy to have him, Philo looks like he wants to be there just as much as the Scrambler, who decides his membership there is a waste of time and quits. The League of Annoyance moves forward regardless, but 2 of them are arrested after a failed attempt to kill the Wonder Twins, saved by Gleek, who's working on his own shit, but we only have so much time. Sometime after, their school hosts their annual science fair, where Jaina gets to show off her invention, a solar-powered flashlight, which the judges quickly point out is more or less pretty useless and is quickly overshadowed by Polly's project. Polly has produced a theory that the internet is essentially alive due to the fact that it functions in a very similar sense of the human consciousness. As such, it will one day be able to wake up to a conscious state and move from simply absorbing random data given to it by its users to actively telling everyone what to think and feel, a concept that she is quick to point out to her impressed judges would be a rather terrifying prospect. But not everyone is focused on futuristic dread, as Jaina and Zane both seem to get their first Earth dates, the latter with a woman who asks him about his pet monkey, and the former with a jock meathead-looking dude named Red. Red invites Jaina to a work thing later that night, and she accepts, but shortly convinces Polly to go with her as backup. Later that night at the Hall of Justice, Superman informs the twins that they'll get a rare night off because today is the day of the Legion of Doom's big villain mixer, which means they have time to focus on more cosmic threats. This seems to be the perfect opportunity for the twins to explore their respective love lives. But, much to Jaina's dismay, it turns out Red's work thing also happens to be that exact mixer. Concurrently at the mixer, the Scrambler has introduced himself to Philo and asked him about how he got roped into League of Annoyance. He explains that he originally designed technology for Lex Luthor that allowed him basically to access any and all information on cloud servers without needing to break into computer systems. While Lex was initially delighted by the tech, various world governments, not so much. And while they couldn't go after Lex, they could go after Philo, resulting in the assassination of his wife. Anyway, back to Jaina, who has been approached by her date for the evening and has revealed himself to be the villain known as Red Flag, which just, well done, Russell, well done. Polly arrives shortly thereafter to tell her how bad of an idea is to still go out with him, but she's quickly distracted when she notices her dad nearby. An inevitable fight ensues before she storms out of the mixer. The rest of the night doesn't much improve, with Zane's date getting back together with their ex during their date, and Red Flag living up to his namesake. Zane takes his experience, quite frankly, better than 99% of men would in this situation. Like, holy shit, chucking a good mindset to have, which inspires Jaina to run right from the hills from Red Flag. The next day, after Polly wins the science fair, she confides in Jaina her concerns about her dad being in the League of Annoyance. While Jaina tries to convince her that he wasn't there by choice, Polly can't help but be worried about them dragging him down with them. Jaina decides to do something about it, but it might already be too late, as the Scrambler is at their home where he is quickly discovered by Philo. Scrambler asks Philo how he got caught up in this crazy life of theirs. He explains that despite his genius intellect, he had a hard time finding employment because of his, specialty. Specialty here meaning, of course, blatant racial profiling, some done just by looking at his name. Lex was the only one who would give him a job doing what he wanted to do, but at great personal cost. Philo flips the question back to Scrambler, who explains that he used to be a magician, but realized people don't really care for real magic. He then goes on to explain the construct of magic. A magic trick consists of 3 parts. The first part is the pledge. Your promise is to disrupt the status quo. The next part is the turn. This is where you keep your promise, where you destroy everything they thought they knew about the world. But that's not what they want. The turn is terrifying to people. What they really want is the third part, the prestige, which is where you return everything to the way it was at the beginning. This is what they applaud. They don't want magic. They want your reassurance that everything will return to normal. To them, it's a game. Now, if we were to perform a trick where things do not go back to normal, that would be magic. Scrambler then proceeds to explain his plan to Philo, who calls him insane in response. They're interrupted by Polly, at which point Scrambler excuses himself, but leaves his card if he changes his mind. Meanwhile, Jaina has challenged the remaining League of Annoyance members to a fight at the local zoo, which they accept. Luckily for the twins, the most powerful of the 3 is simply Cell Phone Sylvia, who is more or less just a white woman with a phone. But not just any phone. The phone Sylvia wields is actually a Kryptonian phone that is powered by fear. It has the power to zap away anyone she's afraid of, which she describes as thugs, lurkers, undesirables, anyone really. which is just not a surprising response. Anyway, the twins make short work of the League, and Sylvia flees back to headquarters where she begins frantically calling the Legion of Doom for assistance. She explains in a resignation message that she thought by joining the League, she could make a difference. That this used to be her town until they came in and made her feel like she no longer belonged. And in case you're not clear who they are, take an educated guess. Her attention is interrupted as someone begins entering the factory. Sylvia panics at what she perceives as one of them breaking in, only to realize too late that it's actually Philo, as she zaps him away with her phone. Unfortunately for her, the whole thing is caught on video. This causes a media scandal to which Sylvia tries to defend herself by saying that this one mistake does not reflect the truth in her heart. She then calls Lex desperate for some PR help, to which Lex reluctantly agrees and puts a story on his station, Lex News, with their slogan, "We're just as angry as you are." I'm not kidding, by the way, you can see it on the poster earlier in the story. On Lex News, Sylvia is the topic of their hit show, Lex Imbalances, starring an angry lady who was a judge like 30 years ago, a literal straw man, and Punditron 5000, all of whom go to various degrees to defend her actions. The PR campaign seems to be successful, as police state they will not press charges and that she acted within her rights. Much to Polly's dismay, who responds thusly. Her right to what? To not have to look at my dad? At me? At any of us? Do we even get the right to exist? In the end, the only right they believe in is their right to fear. It's all just a game to them, and what's the point of playing a game you already lost? While Sylvia celebrates her win, gleefully stating how she can finally move on from the ordeal, we're treated to Philo's fate, trapped in the Phantom Zone with the other black people that Sylvia is trapped. Having no way of knowing this though, Polly flies into a rage before deciding to call the Scrambler to enact his plan. It isn't long until they're able to put it into motion as Scrambler makes a worldwide broadcast to announce his intentions. He believes that the people in power, the ones really able to effect actual change, lack the proper incentive to do so. But they might be willing to actually make a system that works for everybody today if they don't know whether or not they're going to be powerful tomorrow. So Scrambler's plan is simple. In 30 days, he will swap the minds of everyone on Earth at random, which means the world has 30 days to make it a place worth living for everyone. And to show he's not bluffing, he randomly scrambles the minds of 1 million people around the world using Polly's cloud technology. While the Justice League tries to find the location of the Scrambler, believing that he's been protected in some kind of high-security facility as opposed to, just chilling on the couch, the Wonder Twins make their way to Lexicon Prison to talk with Praying Mantis, who they hope can shine some light on this one-time cohort. Mantis overplays his hand and refuses to give him anything, but luckily, Jaina manages to hide out as a fly and finds out that Polly is somehow involved. Jaina goes over to her house and tries to talk some sense into her, but she counters with the fact that so many brilliant minds and potential innovators are left to rot because the gates of opportunities are locked to them. That they're just props in someone else's story, and while Jaina doesn't disagree, she points out that most of the people that their plan will affect are completely innocent, and she'd be ripping them from the things that matter to them. Polly responds by saying that that could be part of the problem, that the lives of those struggling are too easy to ignore by these good people. Their goodness solves nothing. The status quo has killed more people than any attempt to fix it. Jaina tells her it's not her job to fix the world, to which Polly replies, no, it's yours. The rest of the world works against the clock to prepare for the Great Scramble. Politicians and leaders rush to fix the problems they caused, people party like there's no tomorrow, Lex finds a way to capitalize on it before flying into space, and Jaina and Zen sat in the Hall of Justice contemplating their situation. But as they're discussing the problem, Jaina realizes something. The new law is going to affect whether or not the scramble happens. The threat of it was enough. Maybe Polly doesn't need to go through with this. She rushes off to try to convince her to delay just a little longer, but it's too late. The Justice League found them first with the help of Zane and is already on the scene to stop her. Too late in more ways than one, it seems, as news reaches the politicians just as they're about to sign the bills into law, meaning they no longer need to sign it. A fact that is met with righteous applause. And thus, Polly and the Scrambler are hauled off to prison while Jaina is left with the guilt of her actions. But hey, at least Zane gets to soak up some newfound popularity out of the deal. Although that popularity might be short-lived, because now the League of Annoyance is out of the picture, there's really not a whole lot for the twins to do. So they get assigned to be Hall of Justice tour guides until things pick back up. The only thing of note happening is a riot caused by violently happy hockey fans. But even that can be dispersed by the League's hidden asset, Repulso, a man whose sole purpose is to use his superpowered horrendous smell to disperse violent crowds from the safety of a crane. only for him to be locked away in his vacuum-sealed room until he is needed again, despite requests for company from people around him. But it looks like things are heating up, as Justice League sensors pick up a meteor heading straight to Earth. Unfortunately, they also found out this news just as the latest tour group is entering the room. So naturally, the story is picked up by Lex News, and the entire city goes into a panic. So out goes Repulso once again and try to disperse the angry mob, but his crane breaks down, forcing him to street level where the mob takes out their anger on him. Luckily, the Wonder Twins show up to save the poor man from the mob, just in time for the Justice League to return from diverting the meteor. The mob asks why they weren't told they were in mortal danger, but Superman only needs to gesture around him for the obvious answer. Their good deed for the day isn't enough for Jaina, however, who laments to Superman how she just keeps losing. She lost her best friend, she's been demoted, and even her brother doesn't have time for her anymore. She did everything she was supposed to do, and this is her reward? Superman tells her that doing the right thing isn't about reward. In fact, it rarely is. It's lonely, isolating work, and sometimes comes with a heavy cost. But this, too, can be a gift. It's easy to know what to do when the validation is flowing. Any dog knows to shrill over while treats are in play. It's only when life is wrecking you and nothing is going the way it should that the universe lets you stand on your own 2 feet for a moment and think. It's only then that you find out what you truly stand for, who you really are. And lonely and isolated though we may be, life always provides us with one consolation: the ability to bond over our mutual isolation. Meanwhile, Polly is putting her genius intellect to work, as she's memorized the routines of every guard at her juvenile detention center to the point where she can just walk out with her 2 fellow escapees. She leads them back to her school to pick up a couple of things just as a high school reunion that the twins are organizing is taking place. Long story, we're skipping over a lot here. Jaina quickly intercepts and pleads with Polly to listen to her. After a brief struggle, she tells her that she believes her father is alive and she has a plan to save him. This convinces Polly to relent and work with the twins, hiding out in their apartment while the twins help the League save refugees being targeted by the military of the fictional country of Zigronia. When they get back, Polly informs them of what she was after at the school: a floppy disk containing code to fix and modernize her father's creation, Colonel 86. See, Philo was a pioneer in computer engineering, and in 1988, he designed a computer program that was meant to solve all the world's problems. But the limitations of technology at the time meant that the program couldn't possibly process all that data, forcing it to degrade and eventually become wildly dangerous. This forced Philo to shelve the project, but Polly hoped to fix it. Or at least, she did before he disappeared. This encourages Jaina to reveal a story of her own from her planet Exor. Many years before they were born, Exor was caught in what she describes as a wave of xenophobia led by Rylan the Judge, later known as Rylan the Merciless, who sent thousands of people to the Phantom Zone in an act referred to as the Purges. Nobody liked to talk about the Purges, including their father, so the twins grew up not knowing the horrors of their history. That is, until their father took them to the Museum of Truth and Reconciliation to show them their reality. Raylan was their grandfather, and he used a device just like Cell Phone Sylvia to commit mass genocide. It's a stain on their family and legacy that convinced the twins to migrate to Earth, to carry the shame of that legacy, and to reject the world he built for them. But before the twins left, Jaina grabbed her grandfather's journal, which contained instructions on how to use the disruptor to bring people back from the Phantom Zone. The following day, Jaina is resting in the break room in the Hall of Justice when Superman comes in to check on her. Jaina once again used the opportunity to pry Superman for his perspective on humanity and the refugees they rescued not too long ago. Yesterday, when you were rescuing those refugees, part of me felt guilty. Guilty for not having suffered what they had. Guilty for being the product of a world like the one that hunted them. Guilty for being the product of a man like the one they were fleeing. Is that what life is? Being the beneficiary of crimes you can never make right? Constantly trying to outrun our shame, knowing that it will find us wherever we go? Superman replies, "It's sometimes easier to see the world as the epilogue to the mistake of our ancestors, rather than the prologue to our resilience. We're all born to disasters not of our making, but that doesn't mean we're doomed, and does not absolve us from creating something better. Because in a world filled with destruction, the act of life is reclaiming what we can from the wreckage. The past is gone, and we can never make up for the horrors committed in our name. But repairing the damage of the past is not only our duty, it's the only thing we do that matters. Because in the end, that's what we are. The parts of the world we decide to keep, and those which we should have thrown away." But while this is all happening, a young couple bought Philo's old server in an estate sale and plugged it in, only to find the corrupt program, Colonel 86, waiting to greet them, bring the dangers of the past to the forefront. Our heroes are yet to be aware of this new threat, however, as they are busy at work getting the pieces in play to save Philo from the Phantom Zone. This includes sneaking into Lex News and stealing Sylvia's disruptor, who has now become a Lex News correspondent because of fucking course she has, as well as stealing Lex's spaceship. The spaceship that Lex has been stranded on in orbit since the Great Scramble because the interns decided it'd be better just to let him rot up there and use the shit out of their corporate credit card. Respect your employees. The Wonder Twins are ultimately successful in rescuing Philo from the Phantom Zone, but come back to a world in chaos as Colonel 86 has connected himself to the internet and has very quickly taken over the world. But unfortunately, or fortunately, hard to say, he's also not very smart. He thinks he's a very smart businessman by investing his owner's savings into Blockbuster Video, disables computers on airplanes because he believes they don't need them, digitally annuls millions of same-sex marriages because that can't be, and promises to reward supporters with jobs mining coal. To everyone's surprise, it isn't long until Colonel 86 starts actually gathering supporters for his cause, rallying what seems to be legions of middle-aged white men to riot in the streets in support of their new fascistic leader. Okay, maybe it's not that surprising, all things considered. It isn't long until Lex himself starts to exploit the situation and uses Lex News to throw support at the would-be dictator, posing the question, is Colonel 86 the best thing ever to happen, or the bold voice of a forgotten generation? A stretch so wide, even Straw Man has a hard time going along with it. The Justice League send Repulso to fend off the crowd, while Polly and the twins head off to try and stop the Colonel with their updated software. But Colonel 86 rejects the software, forcing Philo to go in and take care of the problem himself, proclaiming that sometimes a program refuses to be updated. He refused to acknowledge that the world has changed, but assumes that the world was at its best when they were at theirs. In a perfect world, we would all update ourselves regularly, but as we know, this is not a perfect world. And if we can't update the program, then we have no choice but to shut it down. Meanwhile, Repulso has a message of his own to the supporters of Colonel 86, the one who claimed the world used to be theirs, and they took it from them, the ones who claim he should be among them. We tell ourselves that we're the adults, that we're the ones who understand how the world really works, and so we try to stop the world from changing and then throw a tantrum when it changes without us. But the world needs to grow up, and frankly, so do we. The crowd quickly disperses after Colonel 86 is shut down, at which point Zane wonders how so many people can love such an obvious monster. To which Jaina replies, they never loved him, they loved the monster he allowed them to be. It's not long after that the Justice League gets wind of the twins' recent activities and confronts them about it, but Jaina has had enough. She rebukes the League for arguing about laws and processes and procedures rather than doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That if they won't fix it, she and her brother will. Green Lantern dismisses the argument as them being bored, but Jaina's not having it. She had a friend in trouble, so they helped. There was a father wrongfully imprisoned, so they freed him. While they broke some rules to do it, doing so changed the world. When Superman replies that that's not their job, Jaina retorts, no, it's yours. Shortly after, the twins are ambushed by Cell Phone Sylvia and a couple of goons Lex quickly scramble together to help, including the Rain and the supervisor from Lex's private prison, in order to get her disruptor back. However, in a surprise twist, it turns out the Scrambler switched bodies with the supervisor while in prison and helps the twins escape and zap Sylvia into the Phantom Zone. After telling his story, the Scrambler leaves the twins on one parting piece of advice. Be careful what box you let people put you in, because once inside, you may never get out. The twins head back to the Hall of Justice to face the music, only to find the League along with Philo and Polly waiting for them. And much to their surprise, Superman says they're not going to arrest the fugitives. Instead, he wants them and the twins to help run a new division of the Hall of Justice called Asterisk, assessing strategic threats requiring innovative skills and knowledge. A department meant to help fix the problems of the world that they can't see or solve with strength. Superman then gives his last speech of the series. The fate of the world hangs upon a single choice, whether we're going to put as many minds as possible to work solving its problems or creating them. I know this planet has a history of doubling down on its mistakes, but the strange thing is, the more you despair of the human race, the more actual people mean to you. And you start to realize that we are not only the product of what we've lost, but also what we have found. I hope you forgive us old people if we lose sight of that sometimes. And thus the twins and the maths seek out their own form of justice in both big and small ways, working together to solve the problems that strength alone can't fix. Leave it to Mark Russell, the same guy who made Snagglepuss a torture-closeted McCarthy-era playwright, to take quite possibly the silliest characters in the DC canon and pack it full of some of the densest social, racial, and political commentary that I've ever seen in a mainstream comic. And we certainly don't have time to unpack each and every bit of what Wonder Twins intends to cover, but I've managed to narrow it down to what I believe to be the most important pieces worth addressing and what is essentially at the core of the series. Wonder Twins focuses primarily on the various systems that allow for societal inequality and mistreatment of its people to not just exist, but to be normalized and accepted by the general masses. While the book is layered with commentary on what it thinks is the root of society's ills, the main topics we're going to focus on in this video are the American prison system, economic inequality, American exceptionalism, and dehumanization. Obviously, any one of the topics that Russell discusses in this story can make up a video by itself, but we're going to attempt to break these down as much as we can with the time we have. Also, I did a lot of research for this video, so goddammit, I'm going to use it. Now, throughout the story, Lex Luthor is clearly framed as the supreme capitalist of sorts, having a hand in pretty much every privatized industry that can exploit people in one form or another. So let's just establish now that anytime you mention Lex or anything with his name on there, we're actually just talking about long-standing capitalist structures, which we'll be referring a lot within the next couple sections. We're good on that? All right, cool. So let's start off with a system that's clearly prevalent through much of this book, the American prison system and the prison industrial complex. Wonder Twins makes several mentions on not just how privatized prisons use prisoners as direct sources for funds and free labor, but also on how it treats the people caught in the system as nothing more than disposable. Even as Jaina correctly points out, most of them don't need to be there. Specifically 90% of them, which is a very important number we'll get to later. In fact, Jaina seems to be the one that's most disturbed by the inhumane way we treat people caught in the system. A system that everyone around her insists works despite the giant leaps of logic they need to make to justify it. She can clearly see how these people are being exploited. She can clearly see how the people who get out want nothing more than to escape the life that put them there, but can't because it won't allow them to. She can see that what they do as superheroes, find the bad guys and locking them away, doesn't solve anything. It just perpetuates a corrupt system that then profits off the bodies they drop off. And she has no idea how nobody else sees this, how this has been allowed to continue unchallenged, uncompromised. But the Scrambler knows, he knows exactly why. That's never been about justice, it's always been about power. The power to treat everyone as if they're for sale, to do with them as they please, a system that pretends to work for everyone while only working for few, by tricking the rest that peace and quiet is synonymous with justice. That way, the general populace will never have to challenge themselves with the knowledge as to where that quiet comes from and whose freedom needs to be taken to get it. He explains it as clear as day when he describes magic. People like to think they want the status quo challenged. They think they want to see things change, but the minute you engage in the turn, where they enact that change, the people that benefited the most from the status quo panic and scream and cry for the prestige, where they put everything back to normal. Polly understands exactly why too, but from a different perspective. This is something that Russell never says explicitly, it's not clear why, but it's heavily implied through many of Polly's musings, particularly around the idea of justice, that's not just motivated by a desire for power, it's also driven by white supremacy. After all, Polly and her father are clearly the two smartest people in the entire series, but they meet resistance at every turn by people who want to control them. And if they can't do that, make sure they're hidden from fearful eyes. And the book makes it clear as day that their blackness absolutely plays a role in that. Polly positions that the white society she finds herself in actively does not care about her or people like her, or as she puts it, the world is just used to watching us die. The status quo has killed more people than any attempts to fix it. And as Polly also correctly points out when Sylvia gets away with attempted murder of her father for the crime of being black, the only right America believes in is their right to fear. And of course, this only scratches the surface of the realities of the American prison system. And the reality is, the American prison system has always been, and remains, a racist institution. Now, before all of you rush to the comments, let's go into why. And to truly do the subject justice, we need to explore three key time periods: the post-Civil War Reconstruction Era, the Civil Rights Movement through the Reagan Era, and 21st century privatization. Now, this is going to be a massive historical info dump, but I promise you, all of this is relevant. Something important to note is while penitentiaries and imprisonment has become so ingrained in the American justice system as to seem inseparable, this was not always the case. In fact, up until the end of the Civil War, prisons weren't actually a very popular form of punishment in America. It certainly had them as an option for punishment, but the idea of a penitentiary didn't arise until 1820, and even then, didn't grow into a substantial industry until much later. And that much later came during the Reconstruction Era, an era just after the Civil War when black people were truly free from the bondage of slavery through the South's implementation of the 13th Amendment, followed by the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment, which granted freed slaves citizenship and the right to vote. All of which the South adopted kicking and screaming, by the way. The Reconstruction Era is largely considered to be one of the most progressive eras for the Confederate States in history. However, that does not mean these same states didn't try everything they could to maintain control of these newly freed men and women however they could, especially since President Johnson, being the horrible racist he was, allowed them to maintain state rights during this period. This meant that Confederate states could dictate the requirements for how black people could vote and live there. This would start with the adoption of the Black Codes, a series of legislations that attempted to regulate the behavior of freed black people to resemble that of slavery. This was largely just a slightly repackaged version of the slave codes. This included vagrancy laws adopted in 9 states that made it a crime to not work in some way. These laws are selectively applied to black people. This was followed by convict laws that allowed for hiring out of prisoners through plantations and private companies. This basically allowed Southern plantation and company owners to reintroduce the recently freed slaves right back into slavery in a way that was completely legal. Because as much as we praise the 13th Amendment for rightfully freeing all slaves in America, it comes with one massive exception that most people tend to glance over. The 13th Amendment abolishes all slavery and indentured servitude in America, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In other words, if you're convicted as a criminal, the state has the right to use your body for slavery. And in case you're wondering, yes, that exception is still there, and at the time of writing, no attempts to remove this exception has been successful. So take an educated guess as to what happened next. Prison population skyrocketed, filled overwhelmingly with black people who became the victims of convict leasing. Convict leasing was a practice in which groups of convicts would be sold to various plantation and company owners to perform the same duties as slaves. This was a system so cruel that scholars have called it worse than slavery, because while an individual slave could be seen as an investment for the slave owner, convict leasing rated their profitability in groups, meaning that they could legitimately work people to death without losing profitability within the overall group. And in case there's any ambiguity that these prisoners were in any way distinguishable from slaves, the decision by the Virginia Supreme Court, Ruffin v. Commonwealth, made at the height of the Reconstruction Era should clear that up. For a time, during his service in the penitentiary, he is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords to him. He is for the time being a slave of the state. He is civilator mortis, and his estate, if he has any, is administered like that of a dead man. So with that in mind, it should be no surprise that the prison population over the next decade grew 10 times that of the general population. And it should be even less of a surprise that the prison population was overwhelmingly black. Now, while the system would eventually be abolished, it would only be replaced by a new system of racial segregationist laws known as the Jim Crow laws. Because if there is one thing you should be taking away from a lot of what we're going to discuss today, it's that racism is extremely adaptable and highly tied to American capitalism. Now let's fast forward to the 1940s. White people in the North had progressively turned on the Jim Crow laws for multiple reasons, but the most prominent appears to be due to the influence of World War II. It was quickly becoming apparent that condemning the crimes of Hitler and the Third Reich against the Jewish people while also maintaining the very laws that inspired his oppressive methods and were deemed too cruel by Hitler's advisors was more than a little hypocritical. And there was also concern that continuing to enforce these laws would make black people susceptible to communism from Russia who were committed to racial and economic equality at the time. As such, public pressure to release Jim Crow's oppressive hold on the lives of the black community resulted in a few key landmark court rulings, such as Smith v. Allwright in 1944, which ended all white primary elections, and McLaurin v. Oklahoma in 1950, that forced Oklahoma to desegregate its law school. This was followed by what is often cited as the beginning of the end of Jim Crow, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which effectively ended all segregation in public schools. The response from the South in this ruling was unfortunately predictable. Nearly 50 new Jim Crow laws were passed shortly after, the Ku Klux Klan returned to perform terrorist attacks on black homes, churches, and people, and NAACP leaders were attacked and killed, among other actions taken to halt desegregation as much as possible. This would inspire the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, which would eventually lead to the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1963, followed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But a lot happened between the beginning and end of the movement that would plant the seeds for how the prison system would adapt to the changing climate of racism. And that would largely begin with the adoption of a term you might be familiar with, law and order. Yeah, this is where that term comes from. In the late 1950s, civil rights protesters used direct action tactics to force Southern states to desegregate many of its institutions. As a result, Southern governors wanted to create dissent between black civil rights activists and their white allies. So, they began to classify these tactics as criminal and liken the rise of the civil rights movement as a breakdown of law and order. From that point, firefighters used hoses to break up rallies, and police would often join forces with the KKK to perform horrendous acts of violence and terrorism on black activists. All the while, any public support for the movement was labeled as rewarding lawbreakers. Any of this starting to sound familiar? It fucking should. According to Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration and the Age of Colorblindness, for more than a decade, from the mid-1950s until the late 1960s, conservatives systematically and strategically linked opposition to civil rights legislation to calls for law and order, arguing that Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of civil disobedience was a leading cause of crime. That's right! As much as we like to praise MLK's civil rights movement now as peaceful and protesting the right way, we often tend to glance over the fact that it was just as often characterized as violent and criminal because of how much it threatened the status quo. Again, any of this sound familiar? But as time passed and it became clear that the acceptable language around race was changing to become more inclusive, segregationists changed their language from overt and explicit racism to calls to crack down on crime. This is rhetoric that would quickly become the new way to talk about race without actually talking about race among conservative politicians. And thus, cracking down on crime quickly became their big talking point after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. This would even go so far as to change the alignment of the major political parties as we know them today. This video is already long enough as it is, so we won't go into this in great detail, but the short version is that the South was originally run by Democrats, who were much more conservative at the time, with the Republicans being the Liberal Party. That is, until the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that, while vehemently opposed by Southern Democrats, still received bipartisan support. This created a feeling of betrayal and resentment towards the Democratic Party in the South and created an opportunity for conservative Republicans to trigger a new majority within their party in a move called the Southern Strategy. Thus, Republicans started to become more conservative and Democrats more liberal. Sidebar, this is also why people who try to use Democrats start the KKK as a gotcha clearly have no idea what they're talking about. The Southern Strategy used law and order rhetoric to deliberately stoke racial fears and antagonism within the South to push their agenda within the Republican Party and gain support. This is not speculation, by the way. This has been confirmed to be a key strategy, especially when employed by President Nixon. As explained by one of his key advisors, H.R. Hellman, he emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. This strategy proved to be so effective that it was soon adopted more and more by conservatives to create racial polarization wherever possible. By 1968, data collected by the Gallup poll showed that 81% of respondents felt that law and order had broken down in this country, with the blame being placed on black people who started riots and communists. Again, sound familiar? Hell, Nixon dedicated 17 speeches specifically on law and order, in case his methods aren't clear by this point. Now, while Nixon definitely contributed massively to the conservative Republican movement in its early days, he actually didn't pass much legislation to criminalize black people directly. He was much more concerned with using propaganda to sow dissent. No, the role of criminalizing black people would fall onto President Reagan. See, by the time Reagan ran for president, conservatives had fallen to a routine of saying we should have racial equality, but pushed back on everything that could get us there and bucked the blame back on individualism. So when Reagan came along, he pretty much knew how to use racial tensions and hostility to his advantage without actually referencing race, disguising it under labels such as welfare queen and criminal predators. These labels and rhetoric based on colorblindness basically made it impossible for liberals to properly call Reagan out for his racist rhetoric because they couldn't explicitly prove that he meant it to be racist. Therefore, he was allowed to appeal to his most racist and hateful base without consequence. And this would culminate in one of Reagan's most infamous actions, the declaration and enforcement of the war on drugs in 1982. And that leads us full circle back to the American prison system. Now, Reagan wasn't the one to actually coin the term war on drugs. That would once again be President Nixon in 1971, in which he declared drug abuse to be a public enemy #1. However, Reagan would be the first to run his campaign on the promise of cracking down on crime and make fighting that crime a matter of federal government. At the time of his declaration, less than 2% of people actually viewed drugs as the most important issue affecting America, which means his war was never about addressing a problem that actually existed, so much as giving him a reason to target and criminalize black people at every turn. This started by allocating significantly more funds to federal law enforcement, increasing the FBI's budget from $8 million in 1980 to $95 million by 1984. He would also increase the Department of Defense anti-drug spending from $33 million in 1981 to $1.04 billion by 1991. All while funding for programs designed to treat, prevent, and reduce drug abuse dropped significantly. They would then get state and local law enforcement on board by, to put it lightly, actively bribing them to make it an active priority. This was done by rebranding a program that provided federal aid to law enforcement as the Edward Byrne Memorial State and Local Law Enforcement Assistance Program, or the Byrne Program for short. This program would allow the federal government to offer millions of dollars to state and local law willing to take part in Reagan's war on drugs, an offer they eagerly accepted, resulting in the formation of multiple narcotic task forces throughout the country. And pretty much every president afterwards would contribute to these war on drug incentives, providing police and military weaponry, for example, as a practice that would only get worse under President Bush and especially President Clinton, who took everything Reagan did and just added to it. Even President Obama would renew the Byrne program under his economic stimulus plan. They also offered an obscene amount of resources, intelligence, and firepower to pretty much any law enforcement agency willing to take up the cause, with one retired police chief from New Haven, Connecticut, going so far as to say on the record, "I was offered tanks, bazookas, anything I wanted." This was largely allowed to happen by the passing of the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act of 1981, in which local and state law was given access to military tech, intelligence, research, and weapons with the express purpose of drug interdiction. Within the next decade, SWAT teams were formed in pretty much every major city in the country to fight the war on drugs, which were rarely used up to this point, and even then only to handle things like hostage situations or prison escapes. But now they handle drugs, and that's how it would remain. Police and law enforcement agencies were also allowed to keep a majority of the money and assets they found during drug raids. This gave them a much greater incentive to raid the properties of those suspected of holding or selling drugs, regardless of whether or not those suspicions held any merit. And since most of these forfeitures were uncontested, this means this policy was very actively exploited. And this is even getting close to all the ways in which law enforcement during the Reagan era was able to actively target and exploit innocent people for his war. Now, with all that being said, you're probably wondering, okay, all that sounds pretty bad, but how was it racist, and what does it have to do with the prison system? And wasn't this originally about the Wonder Twins? Well, let's break it down. According to the Human Rights Watch in 2000, black people constituted 80 to 90% of people sent to prisons on drug charges, at a rate of 20 to 57 times more than white people in at least 15 states. And that insane differential can be traced back to the beginning of Reagan's war on drugs, in which the arrests of black people for drug-related charges quadrupled in 3 years. By the year 2000, the incarceration rate of African Americans was more than 26 times what it was in 1983. In comparison, the rate of convictions for Latinos within the same time frame was 22 times and 8 times for white people. The rate is this disproportionate despite the fact that there's currently no evidence to suggest that people of color use or sell illegal drugs any more than white people. In fact, surveys suggest that white people, particularly young white people, are more likely to engage in illegal drug activity than people of color. This is further supported by the fact that young white people go to the emergency room for illegal drug use 3 times more than black people of the same demographic. And it's not even true that all drug sales are made in historically low-income neighborhoods. Most white people get their drugs within their neighborhoods, same for black people, and university students buy it from each other. And yet, despite that, black people are put into state prisons at a rate of 13 times that of white people. And to add another wrinkle, a statistic in 1995 showed that only 15% of black people were active drug users, and that number has not changed all that much in the years since. But whenever you point this out to people who want to maintain this belief that America is colorblind and no longer racist, they'll go to black-on-black crime. It must be because they commit more violent crimes, not racism. But that's not true either, because violent crimes actually make up a very small percentage of overall state and federal convictions. For example, in regards to the prison population growth between 2000 and 2010, only 0.4% of convictions in the federal system were from homicide, yet 61% were from drug convictions. And while violent crimes do account for about half of most states' prison populations, that's only because people with violent offenses have longer sentences, while drug sentences tend to be much shorter. This means that the latter population is circulating at a much faster rate than the former, resulting in a lot more people with drug convictions on their records. And here's the thing, your belief in any of these myths about the war on drugs may not even be your fault, because the media has been working since 1985 to paint committers of crime as minorities. That's why whenever someone brings up the term drug dealer, the first image in your head is very likely that of a black or Latino person rather than a white one. And this isn't speculative or hyperbole either. This has been an open secret. As Jerome Miller, former executive director of the National Center for Institutions and Alternatives, explains, there are certain code words that allow you never to have to say race, but everybody knows that's what you mean, and crime is one of those. So when we talk about locking up more and more people, what we're really talking about is locking up more and more black men. And this rhetoric has been amplified so much that the term drug criminal and black quickly became synonymous. In fact, this is the kind of rhetoric that Russell is so clearly satirizing with Lex News, a news station designed specifically to stoke fear and hate towards some kind of other and promote nostalgia for an era that never existed. He even goes so far as to name one of the pundits there after a common bad faith tactic that Fox News and Newsmax use all the time. And then, when these people are released from prison with a minor drug felony, they're then labeled as a felon in the eyes of the law pretty much for the rest of their life. Which means legally, they've taken away their right to vote, their ability to access government benefits, their access to housing, largely due to President Clinton's one strike and you're out legislation. And because of extensive background checks, it's almost impossible for them to even get a job, all while being shackled with heavy court debts and often strict requirements imposed by probation and parole departments that can result in returning to prison if not met. One of which is usually maintain gainful employment. And we're the only country that does this. Even Germany lets people vote in prison. Our disenfranchisement of justice involved people is so bad that the United States Human Rights Committee has accused our disenfranchisement policies as discriminatory and violating international law. And this isn't even getting into the social and family aspects of how these people charged with these minor offenses are affected long after their release. But surely we could sue the government or law enforcement agencies to stop this rampant and obvious discrimination, right? Nope, because the Supreme Court has made it all but impossible to do so. Some of the most well-known court cases that do so are McCleskey v. Kemp, where they ruled that racial bias could not be challenged under the 14th Amendment without clear evidence, Wren v. United States, which barred victims of racial discrimination by police for being able to claim racial discrimination at all, United States v. Burgundy-Ponce, which permitted police to allow race to be a factor when deciding who to pull over for a random drug search, and Alexander v. Sandoval, which barred victims of discrimination from even being able to sue the police for discrimination, period. And there's so much more. There's so much more we can go into. But if you don't get the idea by now, I don't know what to tell you. So when you put all this together, the Reconstruction Era, convict leasing, law and order, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, the Supreme Court, and many other factors we haven't discussed, a pattern becomes more than clear. America has always used the prison system as a way to maintain control over the lives of black people. It is a racist, broken system and is that way by design. And then we have taken into consideration just how much this is tied to capitalism and has become entwined with corporate economic interests in a system that is referred to as the prison industrial complex, the complex that Wonder Twins most directly criticizes. Now, as you've already mentioned, prisoners have pretty much always been used for profit in ways that go beyond convict leasing well before Reagan started his war on drugs. For example, during the post-World War II era, prisoners were subjected to numerous medical research experiments that would directly fuel the pharmaceutical industry in ways that were both unethical and more than a little creepy. For example, one research dermatologist, Albert Kligman, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s, conducted hundreds of unethical medical experiments on male prisoners, who described his first viewing of these men as follows. All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. Which... do I really need to explain how that's a red flag? Because when a doctor is saying something that sounds like it belongs in an episode of Hannibal, it's a red flag. Now granted, this particular practice was outlawed in 1974, but capitalism would just find a new way to profit off the bodies of the prisoners, which received a heavy boon with, you guessed it, the war on drugs. The sudden surge in arrests quickly caused prison overcrowding, particularly in New York City, where the Rockefeller drug laws in 1973 were heavily incriminating non-violent drug charges with minimum sentences of 15 years and max sentences of 25 to life. This, along with the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, resulted in prisons quickly overflowing, causing the state to force a prison expansion by financing it through the Urban Development Corporation, or the UDC for short. Because of the financing, the UDC technically owned the prisons and leased them back to the government, and eventually went so far as to buy prisons directly from the government entirely. This would basically normalize the idea of prisons being run by corporate entities, one of the largest of which would be the Corrections Corporation of America, or the CCA for short. The CCA was founded in 1983 when it received a contract from government agencies, including the Department of Justice, to build and maintain private prisons, something it would then proceed to do throughout the country. They're still in business, too, currently the second largest privatized prison company in the country, although it's now more commonly known as CoreCivic. The growth of these privatized prisons born from the war on drugs will quickly develop a symbiotic relationship with it, as the increase in arrests for drug-related crimes has done very little to actually stop the use and sale of illegal drugs due to the fact that new sellers would come in to replace the old ones. This is something known as the replacement effect, meaning that for all intents and purposes, these new privatized prisons had a wealth of resources to exploit for growth. As Stephen Donziger, author of The Real War on Crime, the report of the National Criminal Justice Commission, explains, companies that service the criminal justice system need sufficient quantities of raw material to guarantee long-term growth. In the criminal justice field, the raw material is prisoners, and industry will do what is necessary to guarantee a steady supply. For the supply of prisoners to grow, criminal justice policies must ensure a sufficient number of incarcerated Americans regardless of whether crime is rising or the incarceration is necessary. So basically, the more guaranteed arrests made during the continuing war on drugs, the more guaranteed privatized prisons are to profit off that population. And if that population is overwhelmingly black, as we've already established, then prisons are, once again, openly profiting off the bodies of black men and women. And being such a large corporation it has drawn the attention of many other industrial businesses looking to profit from it. Such as Global Tellink, which charges prisoners up to $17 for a 15-minute phone call, as well as Dial Soap, which sells hundreds of thousands of dollars of soap to the various prisons across the country. This doesn't even get into the companies that profit off the food, medical, and transportation services present at these prisons. And then, these same people who are milked for every dollar the system can get out of them are then turned around and used for free labor for many other industries. Wonder Twins chooses to highlight prison call centers, which, I assure you, is absolutely a real thing, but they do so much more for pennies on the dollar, and it should come as no surprise that it's not nearly enough to afford basic necessities that prisons charge them for. Linda Evans and Eve Goldberg, authors of the pamphlet The Prison Industrial Complex and Global Economy, probably said it best when they described it as follows. For private business, prison labor is like a pot of gold. No strikes, no union organizing, no health benefits, unemployment insurance, or workers' compensation to pay. No language barrier, as in foreign countries. Prisoners do data entry for Chevron, make telephone reservations for TWA, raise hogs, shovel manure, and make circuit boards, limousines, waterbeds, and lingerie for Victoria's Secret, all at a fraction of the cost of free labor. And even though money has slowly been pulled from private prisons and the government has started pulling support from these same facilities, let's be clear. All of what I just said is still actively happening. The prison industrial complex has become too large and too embedded in the American economy to be quickly undone. And too many individuals rely on that labor to make it easily dismantleable. And if you combine these facts with the various statistics listed, one thing becomes painfully clear. Racism, once again, evolved from the Jim Crow laws and it became the prison industrial complex. So everything Jaina says about prisons and everything the lexicon does within Wonder Twins is not really that far from the truth. It's extremely likely the centers are run very much like this. It's extremely likely 90% of the people incarcerated don't need to be there. It's extremely likely that criminals like Baron Nightblood are being forced to re-engage in lifestyles they want to get out of because there just isn't any other choice. If anything, Mark Russell is massively underselling it because it really is so goddamn massive. This constant cycle of recidivism isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's designed to keep people in the system. It's designed to take their voice, their dignity, their freedom, and their ability to thrive, especially for people of color. But as we've previously established, Russell has a lot more in his mind than just the prison industrial complex. So let's move on to another form of exploitation of capitalism, wealth inequality. Now I should preface this by saying wealth and income inequality is a vastly complicated problem that way smarter people than I can and have discussed in much more detail. So please know that everything I'm going to be talking about is going to be extremely broad strokes. Throughout Wonder Twins, Russell makes frequent reference to ways in which people of the younger generation are forced to compromise in a crushing economic environment, including being forced to live in cheap biopods, which Lex News portrays as a quirky, fun choice, and interns who are referred to only by number and forced to eat paste because that's the only benefit they get. And of course, it's also reflected in the revolving prison system we just spent a good long time going over. But while the sources behind wealth and income inequality aren't quite as racially motivated as the prison system, although it certainly plays no small part, the systems that have allowed millennials to become the poorest generation in the history of America are no less exploitative. Now, obviously, we're not going to go into all the reasons inequality exists, but we're going to talk about 4 most relevant factors to the topic at hand. union busting, minimum wage stagnation, shifts in the tax burden, and the deregulation of executive pay. And a lot of these largely start with the New Deal. See, unions were a thing back in the early 20th century, but had largely lost their bite by the 1920s due to anti-union efforts, and it remained this way until the Great Depression pushed workers towards desperation, launching a series of significant steps towards proper organization. This was given legal power under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which granted organized unions protected collective bargaining rights. These organizational efforts were further supported by Roosevelt's Brain Trust, also known as New Dealers, as well as various progressive business interests who believed that the economic downturn during the Depression was at least in part due to people's unwillingness to work back-breaking labor for low wages. The result of this movement was a 40% increase in union membership among the labor force, which gave the unions significant power to negotiate not just wages, but also company policies and politics. Unfortunately, if not predictably, these same unions were extremely reluctant to give that same voice and power to women and black people at the same time of its peak. But that being said, the active voice of unions ensured that compensation and labor productivity increased at roughly the same rate in the 1970s and helped create and sustain the middle class. However, the strength of unions obviously presented a problem for capitalists, and more laws were passed on a federal and state level to weaken their power, such as the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which banned secondary labor actions such as boycotts, and the Lundgren-Griffin Act in 1959, which permitted non-member workers to vote in union elections. This invited companies to hire workers to secretly vote on their behalf to further their interests. All of this and much more has resulted in union membership plummeting over the preceding decades as their control and influence in negotiations dwindled, which resulted in greater economic inequality. To put it in perspective, when union membership was only at 10% between 1918 and 1939, the richest 10% of America were gained approximately 40 to 50% of the national income. But as union memberships rose through the 70s, that number dropped to just over 30%. Then, as a union's power began to diminish as well as membership, that same 10% of Americans now earn more than 50% of the national income. In other words, the richest 10% of people now make more money off their exploited workforce than before unions were even popular in the first place. In fact, this diminishing of unions accounts for approximately a third of inequality increases between the 80s and 90s. The loss of collective bargaining power also meant that the ability to get sufficient work-based benefits also dropped dramatically, meaning that employees are now saddled with much higher healthcare costs and receiving a significantly decreased coverage, something that employers could get away with now that took away the power of the unions. Meanwhile, around the same time period, there's also a national debate going on about the minimum wage. Now, wage and labor laws have consistently received pushbacks in the 1910s, with the Supreme Court shutting down many laws that attempted to place maximum work week hours for women and children. This was due to their restricting what was referred to as the freedom of contract, which basically was defined as the worker's right to set the price of his own labor. But once again, the New Deal forced some changes, starting with the President's Reemployment Agreement in 1933, which had employers sign agreements to establish a shorter work week and a minimum wage of 40 cents per hour. This was followed shortly after by the National Industrial Recovery Act, but the Supreme Court struck this down in 1935. The government and the Supreme Court would go back and forth like this for a couple more years until the court finally relented in 1937 in West Coast Hotel Company v. Parrish. In that case, the court ruled that the freedom of contract could be regulated and provide workplace limitations if it is in service of a large societal goal or when there was a massive inequality between the parties to the contract. This finally gave way to the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, in 1938, which abolished most child labor, set the maximum work week to 44 hours, and set the minimum wage to 25 cents an hour. The act received a lot of pushback, particularly from the South, who ensured that agriculture, domestic, and retail workers were not covered under the bill among other exceptions, resulting in the FLSA only covering about a fifth of the overall workforce and the ability to increase the wages given exclusively to Congress. To their credit, Congress did increase the minimum wage to match inflation and roll back these exceptions in the 60s and 70s. However, starting in the late 60s, these increases to the minimum wage started receiving pushback using the argument that doing so would come at the expense of low-income employees and employers, an argument that's total bullshit, by the way. But the argument stuck, resulting in Reagan declaring the minimum wage as public enemy number one and leaving the minimum wage stagnated for a solid decade. Clinton would increase it a little bit, but only by giving tax concessions at the same time. What this ultimately means is that the minimum wage hasn't been sufficient to actually live above the poverty line since the 1960s. Since then, it has dramatically failed to increase along with productivity at a sufficient rate, and stopped altogether around the time of Reagan and the decrease of union power. This was in no small part due to Reagan's intent in giving more money to big businesses as much as possible. We'll get to that in a bit. In fact, If we calculate what the minimum wage should be in correlation with the rate of productivity, it should be much closer to $22 an hour as opposed to the meager $7.25 it is now. And that's not even getting into the many ways the FLSA has failed to increase its labor standards, as well as enforce the weak provisions that are there. But let's go back to taxes for a moment. I know, everyone's favorite subject. Alright, right off the bat, I'm just going to say I'm not going to explain the tax system in its entirety, mostly because I don't fully understand it either. I'm going to assume you have some basic knowledge of your own, and if you don't, Google it and come back. But what you really need to know in this context is that between the 1860s to the 1950s, the tax system slowly grew out of necessity, typically to fight a war of some kind or to finance social programs, although it's mostly the war thing. And during that time, it was the richest people who were taxed higher than those with lower income. This was largely put into law explicitly with the Revenue Act in 1942, which started taking out taxes of your income as you received it, and set the marginal tax rate, the tax rate you pay on any additional dollar of income, Google it, for the lowest income earners to 23%, while the marginal tax rate for the higher earners, at the time being over $1 million, was set to 94%. This precedent would be consistently pushed back on by anti-tax activists for the next few decades, which eventually led to calls for shrinking the government and cutting business costs becoming a national talking point in the 1970s. At this stage, various policies started getting passed to make it more and more difficult to raise taxes. This, of course, brings us back to Reagan, notoriously known for bringing trickle-down economics, also known as supply-side economics, into modern policy. Although, a surprising fact, he never actually used the term trickle-down economics at any point during his presidency. Reagan would then use the justification of wanting to bring America back to the free enterprise nation that was popular before the Great Depression and the New Deal to decrease taxes on the rich, because having free enterprise before a period called the Great Depression didn't serve as a red flag for anyone for some reason. This would lead to Reagan making significant cuts to the top marginal income tax, dropping it from 70% to 50% in 1981, and then down to 28% in 1986. He would also lower the corporate tax rate from 50% to 35%. Now, he also raised personal deductions and exemption thresholds on a lower class, but the resulting policy created massive budget deficits. And the ideals presented by supply-side economics, the entire motivating theology behind this whole thing, never actually came to be. Meaning that deregulation of taxes didn't lead to expansion of businesses and job growth as many were led to believe. It only meant that the richest people got to keep more of their money. And over the preceding presidencies, these policies remain largely unchallenged, with Clinton managing to raise the top marginal tax rate to 40% and Bush bringing it back down to 35%. And then, of course, there's Trump's tax cuts, which brought back down the corporate tax rate to only 21%, along with a bunch of other stuff we won't get into. The deregulation of these taxes also allows the wealthiest to move their money around in various different ways to avoid them, such as offering stock options rather than salaries for top executives. And it's gotten so bad that the average tax rate for the richest 400 people, those who file anyway, fell to under 20% as of 2009. What this means is that the tax burden has shifted dramatically from receiving them from corporate tax to being taken from payroll and personal income taxes. And with the highest earners using various techniques and loopholes to avoid paying either, this means the burden of taxes most impacts those of middle and lower classes. This just means what we already know. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, with each generation showing no real sign of that changing anytime soon. And it also means that the government doesn't actually get enough money from the people who should be paying taxes to fund the systems that are desperately needed to move forward as a country. Now, also during this same period of time, pay for executives is going through its own disturbing metamorphosis. Because these deregulations within corporations allowed CEOs and executives to basically do what they wanted without much accountability or oversight. On top of that, they were also finding ways to work around vague corporate financial disclosure rules created in the 1970s. And while efforts have been made to rein them in a bit, they haven't really been successful in curtailing the problem. Shareholders have also played a role in this exploitation of the system, largely by failing to be the body of accountability that they are presumed to be. Now, to be fair, since 1986, the SEC and the IRS have capped the executive pay deductions to $1 million, with any increases to pay beyond that needing to be approved by shareholders for performance-based work. The problem with that is shareholders have to pretty much rely on the company to define what that term means, and most shareholders don't seem to care enough to actually not vote for a pay increase. In fact, there's only been a few rare instances of shareholders voting against a pay increase enough to stop one. Compounding this issue is the fact that many of their biggest salary increases come from hidden assets, such as stock options and retirement packages, which means top executives basically set their own salary with no meaningful oversight in place to stop it. What that translates to is that many of the top earners in the 1% and even 0.1% are executives and managers, and the current revisions in the tax code results in these same people being very easily able to avoid paying taxes, period. Okay, that was a lot of technical jargon. Let's simplify things a bit. What all of this means, and ultimately that Russell is trying to get at in Wonder Twins, is that the struggles of the modern generation, the exploitation of the workforce, presented as interns in the story, are not an accident. It's not the result of people failing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's not the result of younger people just wanting to live smaller because it's hip. It's because they have no other choice. It's why millennials are shown to be the lowest earning generation in centuries, because the greediest took away our power as people and gave us scraps. But why do we allow all this to happen? What permits such complacency and even worshipping of a system that actively and demonstrably does not serve the majority of the American people? Well, upon analyzing Russell's work, I've narrowed it down to two basic concepts: American exceptionalism and dehumanization. So let's start by defining the term American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is an ideology that states that America is a uniquely positive force in the world and that everything we've done throughout history makes it superior in quality to all other nations. In other words, it's a belief that allows American citizens to maintain the narrative that, to borrow some words from legal theorist Natsu Taylor Sato, presumes that human history is best understood as linear progression towards higher states of civilization, that Western civilization represents the apex of this history, and that the United States embodies the best and most advanced stage of Western civilization, and therefore human history to date. So basically, it's a belief system in which the largest benefactors of American civilization, i.e. white people, have a convenient out from the ugliest spots of our history by either treating history as if it's something that we've moved past, despite everything we've discussed showing we very much haven't, or that it was all for the greater good. Because if America is the one that did it under the guise of American exceptionalism, it must mean we did it for the right reasons, for the right outcomes. Therefore, America is beyond criticism, and anytime any criticism does come up, it can be dismissed as un-American or unpatriotic. And it allows Americans to pretend that the horrors of the systems and structures they consciously or unconsciously support don't exist, or that they are merely relics of the past. And this is a pervasive message that is spread throughout every corner of American culture. Because there is a vested interest in both the people in power and the citizens who benefit the most from it to maintain this false framework. Hell, just listen to how many times a politician will go on TV after some awful tragedy like a shooting or a white supremacist terrorist attack and say something like, "This isn't who we are." But if there's one takeaway you should have gotten by now, is that it is. And it's something we continue to allow and propagate. Because the ideology of American exceptionalism is ingrained in every major institution, from the media to education, which creates this false reality of what America really is and has done. And this is the kind of cognitive dissonance that Jaina and Zane experience throughout their story, with both of them being frequently told that the system works, that everything is great here, and they'll just get used to it. This is despite the overwhelming evidence all around them that this is demonstrably wrong, and they're frequently exposed to all of the ways in which that belief is wrong. Whether it's through Baron Nightblood being treated inhumanely in an environment where his addiction can thrive, to the government throwing out their plans to make the world better the second their own lives weren't in danger. And they can recognize this ideology for the lie that it is because they were once subjected to it themselves, when they learned the peaceful utopia they lived in only came after their grandfather attempted genocide. A fact that they were ignorant about for years of their life, and felt ultimately shamed upon discovering the truth. And you know what? There should be shame. Because the past, especially America's past, is shameful. And as Superman rightfully points out, it is hard to look at. It is hard to look at everything still wrong with the world and not go completely insane. So American exceptionalism allows everyone who benefits the most from the status quo an easy out, a way to not challenge ourselves with the truth of our history, the truth of our culture. And as long as we have an easy out not to look at it, there is absolutely no incentive to do anything to fix it. Or as Carleton University professor Alexis Stotwell puts it, we white people might, on some level, like living with annihilated social and historical memories. We might like to think that the present can be innocent of the past that produced it. We might like to think, though we're ashamed to admit it, that we don't need to tell or hear the painful stories of the actions that created the world we live in. That feeling of wanting to be people unmoored from history, of endorsing the pretense that we have nothing to do with the past that constitutes our material conditions and our most intimate subjectivities, is a feeling that defines us. The social organization of forgetting means that our actual histories are lost, and it means that we have a feeling of acceptance and normalness about living with a lie instead of unforgetting. And this mindset has led to all of us in America believing some bold-faced lies about our history and how we function as a country that permits us to live in willful ignorance. For example, we're all taught that George Washington had wooden teeth. We're not taught these dentures were likely made from the teeth of slaves, along with a bunch of other stuff. We're not taught just how hard George Washington fought to keep his slaves. We're taught that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. We're not taught that Roosevelt has been levying increasingly severe economic sanctions on oil and scrap metal, cutting off their access to import oil by 90%, with negotiations between the nations falling apart shortly before the attack. There's some debate among historians of whether or not Roosevelt did this on purpose to intentionally provoke Japan as a way to justify entering the war, but this hasn't been fully substantiated, so take that as you will. And here's the big one that blew my mind when I was researching for this. We are not taught that a big reason why the Revolutionary War began wasn't just taxes, it was slavery. Because as England's colonial efforts continued to the West, it became not just clear that what they were doing was unsustainable, but that the threat of insurrection for African slaves only grew with time. This would be further escalated by France and Spain, arming African slaves and Native Americans against England, particularly in the Caribbean. What this ultimately led to was slavery being way more trouble than it was worth for England, resulting in the Somerset case in 1772. This was the case in which James Somerset was declared free from slavery after escaping from Virginia and making his way to London. This ruling basically outlawed slavery in England, and it caused the American colonies to freak the fuck out, because slavery accounted for much of their economic growth at the time, and thus the American colonies seceded from England in no small part to protect the institution of slavery. Land of the free indeed. And it's no surprise most of you probably weren't taught this, because to do so would result in having to face just some of the uncomfortable truths about America's history and shatter the illusion of American exceptionalism. And the biggest uncomfortable truth of all? America has always been a country that has been built on and thrives on the suffering of others, usually a racialized or sexualized other. And that brings us to the final theme of Wonder Twins we're going to discuss, dehumanization. As should be painfully obvious by now, one of the most recurring elements of the series is how the rich benefit from the suffering of the poor and people of color. And this has become so normalized that many, mostly straight and white, people would rather fight to preserve the oppressive system than do anything to abolish it, even if they get caught in the system as well. And if fighting fails, then they become the victim and martyrs crying about how their rights are being taken away even while they face no consequences for hateful actions. And while the interlocking social, economic, and political forces that promote and permit this mindset among white people, who we'll refer to as the majority, are extremely complex, it can all be boiled down to the general concept dehumanization, the very thing that ties everything together. But what is dehumanization? For that, we turn to David Livingstone Smith, author of On Inhumanity, Dehumanization, How to Resist It. Smith describes dehumanization as a form of attitude that, to dehumanize a person is to conceive of them as a subhuman creature. To be clear, this is not the same as how you treat people or how you speak to someone. Because as Smith continues to explain, people can think of others as less than human without ever treating those others badly or describing them in animal-like ways. Dehumanization can be very subtle, even asymptomatic. And conversely, people can also treat others in cruel and degrading ways or call them animals without really thinking they are subhuman beasts. Or to put it in more simple terms, dehumanization is not just how you act towards someone or how you speak to them. It's not always overt or recognizable. It's an ingrained belief promoted through various propaganda and culturally internalized beliefs that a certain type of people do not deserve to be called or treated as human. It's not just calling some marginalized groups brutes or super predators or welfare queens. It's believing that to be true, and believing they don't have the right to exist as a result. It's believing a sentiment made by German jurist and political philosopher Carl Schmitt. Not every being with a human face is human. And there is no better representation of this in the book's final antagonist, Colonel 86, who directly appeals to the majority's American exceptionalism and desire for dehumanization by promising a return to a time where it was more socially acceptable to discriminate without criticism or consequences. Because Colonel 86, outside of being an obvious stand-in for Trump, represents the political and social zeitgeist of the mid-1980s. The time when the war on drugs was in full swing, when black people were being openly dehumanized and discriminated against on the most massive scale since the Jim Crow era. The time when dehumanizing language against people of color had become normalized and ingrained into American culture after its birth in the Civil Rights Movement. It's not a coincidence that Philo was reading a magazine with Reagan on the cover when Colonel 86 is introduced, because his policies define the era in more ways than one. Not only did he create the environment to normalize this dehumanizing belief post-Civil Rights Movement and slow all the progress that they made, but he also gave a massive boost to income inequality that we're still feeling the effects of today. And that dehumanization ties everything together, because politicians, lobbyists, and other influential people with power will use dehumanization tactics, only some of which we've outlined in this video, to convince the majority that they're being threatened by the people they're dehumanizing, turning us against the people we should be supporting and lifting up, people we have more in common with than the people with power. And while they're promoting this dehumanizing rhetoric, they're also passing economic policies that allow them to take more for themselves and less for everyone else. And we often don't notice it until it's too late. Or to put that more simply, Dehumanization allows capitalists to exploit people freely because they distract us from what they're doing until it's normalized. And thus, the next generation that gets hit the hardest by this are called entitled or lazy, and the people already struggling with poverty, especially marginalized communities, find it harder and harder to climb out of that hole. Because capitalism and the rich upper class cannot exist without exploitation and the suffering of others. But since this has been taught as the way America is, the way America should be, that this is what makes America exceptional, then it will be defended by its most loyal patriots. Because those most loyal to the cause still benefit from it in some way, even if it fails them in pretty much every other way. Which is why Colonel 86 quickly builds a following of middle-aged white people. It's not because they don't want computers or they actually want jobs mining coal, but because he's a representation of a time where they could treat any marginalized groups as less than human without consequence, so they can be the monsters he allows them to be. All the while, the rich people lock up black people en masse to force into labor. They create news networks to promote hateful dehumanization propaganda. They actively exploit workers to gain as much as possible while giving as little back. And they make it harder and harder to live for the younger generation while saying their plight is their own fault. Now, after about an hour and a half of this, I'm sure most of you are thoroughly depressed and angry, and I don't blame you for that. In fact, you probably should be. As Superman said, the greatest superpower is to look at all the wrong in the world and not go insane. When you look at these deeply embedded systematic problems, most of them were created and sustained long before we were born, it is easy to feel completely helpless, to feel powerless, to feel that any act of activism or awareness is for naught. Because the system always finds a way to adapt and exploit, and that's the way it's always been. It's become so embedded that it's hard to conceive of a country without it. And here's the thing, I don't have the solution to any of these problems. That goes beyond the scope of this video, and neither does Mark Russell. That's not his intention either. None of these problems are easy to solve. I can make a blanket call for prison reform or abolition, for example, but that wouldn't even begin to address not just what system you would replace it with, but also how you would decouple the large corporate power prisons have over the government and the economy. We have shown that history consistently repeats itself to exploit, to dehumanize, and to adapt and maintain both. But here's where we create an asterisk of our own. All the pieces of history we've discussed, everything we've gone over in excruciating detail, also shows one other consistent pattern. These systems adapt because we force them to. Every major shift in forms of discrimination is a direct result of the previous versions becoming no longer publicly viable. In other words, the system adapts because the public turns on it, and it creates a new way to do the same thing in the hopes that we won't notice, and then repeats itself once we do. What this means is the public has always had more power and influence than they ever want you to believe. It's why they consistently turn to dehumanizing rhetoric and policy in an attempt to divide us. Because if all the people, regardless of privilege, got together and kept pushing back, the people with power would have no choice but to cave in order to maintain a semblance of power. And those changes are made kicking and screaming, doing anything to diminish the threat that is the people they're supposed to serve. Because while history has shown that systematic racism and economic inequality are American staples that consistently find new ways to continue, history has also shown that they are no match for a united people. History has shown that strikes work, protests work, civil rights movements work. They just often don't work immediately. And when they do work, those same people with power are banking on you becoming complacent, believing that the problems have been solved forever so they can reintroduce it all over again. And they get smarter about it too, which makes it harder to notice and harder to recognize because we so badly want these problems to be solved forever. Not just so we can feel like we're finally growing and moving forward as a country, but because fighting for these issues is fucking exhausting. And it's hard to feel like we're making any real progress. But as Superman rightfully points out, repairing the damage of the past is not only our duty, it's the only thing we do that matters. Therefore, while any singular solution to any of these complex problems may go over our heads, the only thing that's going to create any of them is giving the people in power no other choice but to create them. And that starts with education. Because to find a solution to any of this, you have to not just know the problem exists, you need to acknowledge that it is a problem, and you need to acknowledge it's a problem that does have a solution. And you need to care enough about it to fight for the discovery of it. That's been the whole point. It's why we spent the better part of 2 hours going over these problems in excruciating detail. Because this is shit you need to know. You need to understand how deep these issues go. You need to understand how much effort has been placed to convince you to ignore it. And if you didn't know any of this before now, don't feel bad. I didn't know any of this either until I started researching for this video. And that's what they want. Because if you can be convinced a problem can be ignored or is too big to solve, then you give the people causing these problems exactly what they want. and it's always at the behest of other people. As things are only getting worse with time, as all of these long gestating problems continue their forward trajectory towards devastating consequences, at some point, we have to acknowledge that we have a duty and an obligation to push for more. Because at the end of the day, Repulso is right. The world needs to grow up, and so do we. And part of that is not just facing the hard reality, but figuring out what to do with it. But once you know the playbook, once you know all of the tricks of the trade and all the little ways they create to exploit and dehumanize, then the rest needs to be pushed back. To fight back with every ounce of you against the status quo and those that benefit the most from it. We can't let them put us into boxes anymore. We can't let them turn us against each other anymore. We need to deprogram our own prejudices. We need to challenge ourselves to the truth of our history and how we continue to propagate its worst mistakes. And we need to have the bravery to push for better as long as it takes for them to finally cave. And this will take time and a lot of consistent effort with no guarantee of success. But while it may be hard to see now, there is hope. Or at least, I believe there is. Because the things that would never have dared been discussed a few years ago are now active political talking points. Police reform, Medicare for all, minimum wage increase, climate change initiatives. While none of these topics have gone nearly as far as they need to enact genuine changes, they've been pushed enough into the social consciousness to make those in power forced to address it. That by itself is not a solution, but it means that coordinated efforts can make an impact. And if enough of us can rally together, then sooner or later, the will of the people will not be denied. But that starts with all of us. No one individual will do. So get educated, spread it, help convince everyone you can that we need to find the solution together, to find a better way. And if we can somehow pull that off and force the change we need to see in the world, then maybe we can finally create a country of progress rather than the one of hate. Let's create our own asterisk and force the ones in power to do something that actually matters. So what are you waiting for? Let's get to work. One of Twin Powers, activate.